Today, Ryan and I are giving you a preview of Epireia. This is a unique game of conflict where you're spending the entire game building up to one big conflict.
Yeah.
And all the while kind of playing through these acts that are going to kind of progress the game along based on what the players do.
Yeah, the theme of the game is the years leading up to the Peloponnesian War, which was a giant war that kind of covered Greece, and you're playing as the different factions in that lead up, like David just mentioned, preparing for that oncoming war that you can just sense is brewing. And the game is divided into the two historical factions that battled in that war, the Delphinian League and the Peloponnesian League. And no matter how many players are playing, you're split up between those two factions. So if you're playing 1v1, like if David and I were playing, we each choose a city, we assign our city to one of the factions, and we go head-to-head against each other. But if you have more players, you actually team up. And the game does change a little bit when you have more players. There's a little bit more interaction that you're going to have. Also, it may be a little harder with multiple players because you're just saying to them, just do exactly what I want you to do. I have a plan, because this is a game all about planning for that final battle.
Yeah, but no matter what, you are going to be facing off kind of in a head-to-head situation, whether it's 2v2 or 1v1. And like I said earlier, you're going to be playing through these acts. There's a few different acts in the game, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, but each one has some possibilities, and you don't know which. You're going to flip first act to see what it is we're trying to do in this first act to progress the game towards that war, which is going to happen after the end of Act 3.
Yeah, and there's a basic set of rules for the game, which we'll talk about briefly, but each one of these acts can introduce new rules, new objectives, and there's no real points in the game, but it does give you rewards. All of these rewards are things that help you progress the game. A lot of those rewards are tracked either on your player board or on these battlefield tracks here, where you're actually going to be committing troops over the course of the game to this oncoming battle. And you'll see here we kind of have a game in progress where we're placing these different troops, and there's the hoplites, the cavalry, and the triremes. Thank you, the ships that they had back then. And you're earning these, so you're earning them either by taking actions during the game or by completing some of these acts to get rewards to add to the battlefield. So while there's no score per se, you can kind of see how each side is doing based on how big their armies are escalating over the course of those three acts.
Well, it's really interesting, too, because a lot of the things you're collecting, not only those military units, but just resources themselves. You're going to be spending those resources on those military units. You're going to be spending those resources on buildings, which are going to help you basically manage your way through the game a little bit better, depending on what buildings you have. And donating to your leagues with some resources in order to get some prestige as well, which is yet another track that you'll go up and get some bonuses. And while we're out here, I do want to point out, this is a prototype, and we kind of have it positioned such that you can see things. My board is off screen here, but players are usually going to be playing across from one another so that these two boards can be next to one each other, as we have right here, because you'll see at the end, those will flip for that final battle.
Yeah, and this map here is where you're going to be trying to send out your influential figures in order to negotiate with some different elements of the game, effectively collecting resources and troops. Now, every city or faction, if you want to call them that, is going to start off pretty much symmetrical. The only real difference at the start of the game is where your city is located out on this map, and you'll notice that you can kind of spread out from there. But your city will become more asymmetric as the game goes. Right away from the beginning, because each player is going to draft one of these administrator cards that's going to sit on the middle of your player board and give you some kind of special ability throughout the game. And then each player has a unique deck of influential figures that are historical figures that were tied to that city. And these will actually come out in play and give you some ability to interact with the board a little bit more.
Yeah, and no matter what act it is, you're going to be playing through the same phases over and over and over until you get through and achieve Act 1, then Act 2, then Act 3. And we have those phases right here. It's going to be the development phase, the diplomacy phase, and I do want to point out it's called diplomacy, but there's not a lot of diplomacy in the traditional sense of board games going on here. And then resolution. In the development phase, you're going to be taking 2 actions on your turn. And those 2 actions are across 3 options.
Yeah, this is where you're going to kind of focus on your player board. You're going to be building buildings, and you'll notice we have these building tokens that will come on and build certain specific buildings. There's 5 different types of buildings. They each do something different to help you progress through the game. They give you access to better military units. They give you prestige, which can unlock bonuses and help you with tie breaking. There's civil buildings that gain resources, political buildings that gain influential figures, and admin buildings that unlock your power. Every one of these administrators has a unique power. So by building these buildings, it's another way that you're kind of determining the course you're going to take by figuring out what your different strengths are. I have a lot of building tokens out because my power was to build some free buildings, which is, that's one unique power out of all the potential administrator powers.
Yeah, when I built some buildings, I was actually focused in the middle of Act 2. Our objective was to get up that prestige track. Now, Ryan ended up beating me on there, but if you build the religious buildings, you're able to increase your prestige. And our Act 2 said it was going to be triggered by the first player who actually got to the 8th space on that prestige track.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things that are going to sort of trigger things moving along. And like we said, at the end, it's going to be that war. So while you're doing all these things, you're wanting to basically collect as many military units as you can along the way. Because if someone goes through this very quickly, or players go through this very quickly, and you haven't gotten a lot of military units, the final war might actually not have very many military units in it.
You've got to prepare. And that's the other thing you can do during that building phase. If you don't want to build buildings, you can build out your army. And you have to decide, because, you can work on building your economy because you think you're going to have a certain number of turns throughout the game. So let's build up our economy. Let's build up our prestige. Meanwhile, the other players, army, and they're rushing through the acts, trying to trigger the war early, which you don't really know exactly how the pacing is going to go. You have to kind of watch what other players are doing and decide, okay, well, David's really focusing on the army, or I'm really focusing on the army, so maybe we should spend a little bit of time focusing on the army. Of course, to build the buildings or to build out your army, you need to be collecting resources. And collecting resources and managing those resources is a big part of what you're actually doing on the board here.
Yeah, you will be gathering resources out here, but before we get to that, the last of those 3 things you can do is actually donate to your leagues out here some resources. That's going to be maybe related to some of the acts, but it's also a way to get a prestige or 2.
Yeah, donating resources to your league. And again, you'll notice the leagues in this corner, no matter how many players, we said 2 leagues. Both players on the team are donating resources to the same league. It is a great way to get prestige points. And prestige points are going to help not only with unlocking bonuses, but also with the tiebreaker in the end of the game. But you might be asking, how do you get resources? And if you look on the board, again, this is a prototype. It printed maybe a little darker.
Yes. You can't see very clearly here, so hopefully we'll have some images.
We'll have some images too, but you'll notice that each of these areas is going to have some kind of resource. So there's 3 different places you can go on this board. And on your turn, during the second phase, which is the diplomacy phase, you're just picking up your influential figure and moving them to another location on the board. Now you'll notice that each one of your influential figures is represented by a token. You've got 3 different tokens, so you can kind of represent, the circle is this particular influential figure. And that matters because some influential figures have powers that might help them on the board, and some have the ability to sail while others don't. Some of these areas are available only by the sea. You have to sail to get to them. They're marked with particular water icons, and only specific influential figures can get out there, which is, again, something that you have to factor in when you're drafting or gaining your influential figures. You don't want to be locked out of those locations potentially.
Yeah, and a lot of the influential figures have advantages depending on what type of movement you're going to make. During this diplomacy phase, you're going to move to an empire or a territory on the map or one of the cities. Again, mostly to collect those resources, but in some cases, those 2 are attached to those acts and what we're wanting to accomplish.
Yeah, certain acts might want you to do specific things or go find specific things or interact with like brigands, for example, which are a token that could be placed on the board. The act might even tell you to put brigands out and then go interact and fight the brigands, which there's not a lot of conflict in this game.
No.
But you can fight the brigands and you can fight each other because there's a really interesting mechanism for how this works. First of all, the outside ring of this board are all the different empires that were connected to Greece. You can send your people out there to negotiate with those empires and maybe get a reward back. These rewards are in the form of resources, they're in the form of troops. Usually they're better resources than what you'd get on the board. Sometimes you can get two of a particular resource. If you come to the different territories, you're maybe getting 1 resource. And if you come to the different cities, you can kind of tax them, kind of come to a trade agreement, and they will give you sometimes soldiers and sometimes copper, which is a harder resource to gain.
And all of this part of the game is dictated by dice. Now, the conflict at the end is very deterministic and very sort of mind gamey, but in this case, you're going to be going to these areas and rolling and trying to get a high enough value on your die to gather some of those things we just talked about. And that's where some of those influential figures come into play. They might give you a bonus on the die. They might mitigate some things, allow you to navigate those things during this diplomacy phase a little bit better.
And some of your buildings give you bonuses and
Right.
rerolls and things like that too. But this is all called the resolution phase. You go step by step to see if your negotiations worked. You'll check if you went to the Empire ring. You'll check and see by rolling the die what rewards they give you. And then in other areas of the game, you might have a battle that occurs. And again, fighting is not a huge part of this game. You're not moving troops around, but your influential figures can fight the brigands and they can fight each other. If you both want to go influence the same territory or go visit the same city, you got to fight each other, and only one person gets to stay. And this is not just based on a die roll. Each one of your influential figures does have a strength that they contribute kind of to that conflict. And so again, when you're choosing your influential figures, that's another thing you're balancing as well.
Yeah, these influential figures are going to dictate how you probably approach the game most of the time. I had Leonidas here in Sparta. It increased my dice by 2 when I was interacting with another influential
so you
leader.
want to go and kick influential people out of every city. You just follow them around kicking them down holes. This is what Leonidas
this is
does.
Sparta.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the 3 phases. And once the resolution is done, you'll have gained resources. You get a little bit of income. You get some income from some of your buildings. Then you go back to the development and you do that whole process again. Hopefully now you've gained enough resources from that last phase that you can start spending them on more buildings, spending them on donating, building up your army a little higher. As you unlock some of these buildings, you unlock higher values of troops. You'll build up your battlefield, and you'll do that again and again and again until you complete the 3rd act, in which case the war begins.
Yeah, and like we said, the war is going to be resolved right here with these 2 boards. You're going to flip those over, and those military tokens that you've been collecting the whole time are now going to be assigned in all of these columns across 3 different fronts. You've got a front, I think it's called the flank.
Yeah, the flank, the center, and the maritime. And you'll notice that different types of units can contribute to different fights. So I can put some cavalry here and some hoplites here, and my ships can only go over here. Now, of course, by the time you actually get to the end, both sides should have, a little bit
Yeah, you're going to
bigger
have more than what we have here.
army by the time you actually get to the end. But what you're going to have are 3 fronts, and each one of the fronts is built up into 3 columns. Each one of those columns is going to be evaluated on its own, but there is one interesting decision you have to make when it comes to the influential figures that you've gathered by the end of the game. Now, you can have gathered up to 3, but it's possible that you might only have 1. These influential figures can increase the value of any one of these individual columns. Each one can be sent to the front one time. So I can send it to the middle column here, the first column here, and the 3rd column here. But what's interesting about that is you don't decide that when you're deciding everything else.
No.
All of the troops are put in, and then everything is revealed. Now, David might decide that he wants to play his influential figure, and you'll assign these influential figures to the different fronts, but he can assign it to any column. So there's a little bit of a guessing game. Like, I don't know what he has here. Now, this situation looks pretty bad for me, considering like David's probably going to win 2 in a row there, and if you win 2 of the 3, you win that whole arena. But we go through all 3 of these different areas, the flank, the center, and the maritime, doing this process of, adding in our influential figures, flipping our tokens, and evaluating each one. And whoever wins the majority here wins the game. So if you can win 2 out of the 3, you win. However, there is a situation where maybe one is a tie, and then you win 1 and 1, in which case you look at your prestige points and your copper even and some other things to determine who breaks that tie.
Yeah, it really boils down to a pretty intense mind game of a conflict at the end of the game with a lot of build-up to get there in terms of like what you're trying to navigate while collecting those military units so that you have them, and even collecting influential figures. If those wasn't clear, we just have 1 at the beginning, and there's things you can do to collect up to 2 more.
Yeah, so you could only have 1. And also, everything that all the players in the team are doing, so your whole league's units are contributing to this battle. So you're each going to have a stack of units that you're going to be placing out here. So this is, an example of what it might look like, but in reality, you're probably going to have much bigger battles than what we've kind of just set up here to show how it works.
Sure. It plays out really interesting at the end. It is one of those things where if you might get to the end, and if you have far fewer military units than your opponent, you might see what's coming.
Yeah.
But obviously, that is the whole goal of the game. But that is Epireia. If you have any questions at all, please make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time, though, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.